The crystal wine glass trembled in Emma's hand as she watched Daniel Chen, the man she'd abandoned 3 years ago when his startup collapsed, stand motionless at her father's mahogany dining table, his worn jacket a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. Her sister Victoria's diamond-studded fingers drummed against her champagne flute as she prepared another cutting remark, while Marcus, Emma's current lover, adjusted his Rolex with that predatory grin she'd once found charming. Emma's father, Richard Whitmore, sat oblivious at the head of the table, discussing quarterly reports for Whitmore Industries, unaware that the unassuming man he'd invited as a potential investor was the same person his daughter had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness as she asked Daniel about his little business ventures. And Marcus erupted into that booming laugh that now made Emma's stomach turn, both of them blind to the storm gathering behind Daniel's calm eyes. What neither Victoria nor Marcus could see, what Emma herself was only beginning to suspect as recognition flickered across Daniel's face, was that the man they were mocking held the actual ownership papers to Whitmore Industries in his briefcase. Having acquired the controlling shares through a shell corporation her father had desperately sold to 6 months ago. But what had driven Emma to abandon Daniel in his darkest hour? What secret had Victoria been hiding about her involvement in Daniel's original company's destruction? And what would Daniel's revelation do not just to her father's empire, but to the fragile threads holding their family together? Emma Whitmore had perfected the art of becoming invisible at family dinners. She'd learned over 29 years that survival in the Whitmore household meant blending into the expensive wallpaper, nodding at appropriate intervals, and never ever challenging her father's proclamations or her sister's poisonous commentary. Tonight should have been no different. The familiar scent of her mother's old perfume, Chanel No. 5, which her father still had the housekeepers spray in the dining room every evening, mixed with roasted duck and her own mounting anxiety as she took her seat beside Marcus. Marcus Bentley was everything her father had wanted for her. Old money, Yale pedigree. A portfolio manager at Wellington and Cross with enough connections to fill the Metropolitan Opera House. He was also, Emma had discovered 3 months into their relationship, spectacularly boring, casually cruel, and currently having an affair with his secretary. But she'd learned that lesson too. Whitmore women didn't make scenes. They smiled. They endured. They pretended. Just like she was pretending she hadn't recognized Daniel Chen the moment he'd walked through the door. 3 years. 3 years since she'd last seen him, and her body had reacted before her mind could catch up. A sharp intake of breath she'd disguised as a cough, a wine glass gripped too tightly, her pulse hammering against her throat like a caged bird. He looked different, thinner, harder. The softness that had once lived in his eyes, that beautiful, naive optimism she'd fallen in love with at 24, had been replaced by something sharper, more calculating. His suit was off the rack, his shoes needed polishing, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that definitely hadn't been there before. Emma forced herself to look away, to focus on the baccarat crystal, the Wedgwood china, the ridiculous opulence of a Tuesday night dinner that could have fed a neighborhood. Her father was holding court at the head of the table, his silver hair immaculately groomed, his $3,000 suit projecting the authority that had built Whitmore Industries from a small textile manufacturer into a textile and real estate conglomerate worth $400 million, or what used to be worth $400 million. Emma had seen the private documents he'd left in his study. The ones that showed the debt, the bad investments, the shell company purchase that had saved them from bankruptcy 6 months ago. Mr. Chen, her father was saying, his voice booming with false bonhomie, I must say your firm's interest in Whitmore Industries is quite flattering, though I confess I'd never heard of Horizon Capital Ventures until my lawyers mentioned your outreach. Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. Emma remembered when his smiles had been genuine, when they'd lit up his entire face. We prefer to keep a low profile, Mr. Whitmore. I find that some of the best deals are made outside the spotlight. Victoria, seated across from Emma, suddenly perked up. Victoria Whitmore Sterling, who'd married the Sterling Hotel's heir 2 years ago and acted as though she'd personally invented wealth. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, Her dress probably cost more than a semester of college tuition, and her green eyes held that particular malice Emma had learned to fear as children. Chen, Victoria said slowly, swirling her wine. That's an interesting name. Did you go to Wharton, Mr. Chen? I only ask because Marcus here went to Wharton, and he knows absolutely everyone who's anyone in finance. Emma's grip tightened on her fork. She could see what Victoria was doing. The subtle interrogation, the implication that Daniel didn't belong in their world, the casual racism wrapped in politeness. Marcus, predictably, was already leaning forward with interest, his chest puffed out like a peacock. Stanford, actually, Daniel replied evenly. Computer science and business. Though I spent most of my time in the engineering labs rather than networking events. How industrious, Victoria said, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. And what sort of businesses have you built, Mr. Chen? Anything we might have heard of? Emma saw Daniel's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She knew that look. It was the same expression he'd worn 4 years ago when her father had first met him, when Richard Whitmore had made it abundantly clear that a tech startup founder was not appropriate company for his daughter. I've had a few ventures, Daniel said carefully, some more successful than others. I'm sure we all have projects that don't work out as planned. That's when it hit Emma, really hit her, why Daniel was here. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random business outreach. Daniel Chen, the man she'd abandoned when his company collapsed, when the investors pulled out, when bankruptcy loomed, was sitting at her father's table discussing Horizon Capital Ventures. The room suddenly felt too hot. She'd left him the night his company, TechFlow Solutions, had officially dissolved. She could still remember every detail of that apartment, the cheap furniture they'd bought together, the wall covered in sticky notes with product ideas, the smell of coffee and desperation. He'd been on the phone with his last remaining investor, his voice hoarse from days of barely sleeping, and when he'd hung up, Emma had already packed her bag. I can't do this, she'd told him, her own voice hollow. I can't watch you destroy yourself over a dream that's already dead. He'd looked at her with such raw betrayal. We can rebuild. We just need time. No. She cut him off, and even now, 3 years later, she could hear the cruelty in her tone. I need stability, Daniel. I need someone who can provide the life I'm accustomed to. This was fun, playing at independence, but I'm not going to be poor with you. She'd walked out. She'd blocked his number. She'd gone back to her father's world, where charity galas and investment portfolios mattered more than passion or loyalty. Within 3 months, she'd met Marcus at a fundraiser. Within 6 months, they were dating. She'd chosen safety over love, comfort over courage. And now Daniel was here. Earth to Emma, Marcus said, snapping his fingers near her face. She flinched. Where'd you go? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, she managed. Just tired. Victoria wasn't done with Daniel. Emma could see it in the predatory gleam in her sister's eyes. Victoria had always been like this, finding weaknesses, pressing on bruises, all while maintaining that beauty pageant smile. So these ventures of yours, Victoria continued, I'm curious what brings someone from the tech world into textiles and real estate. Seems like quite a pivot. Unless, she paused dramatically, unless the tech world didn't work out. I've heard so many stories about failed startups, all those founders who think they're going to be the next Steve Jobs, and then reality hits. Marcus laughed, that braying performative laugh that Emma had once mistaken for confidence. God, Victoria, you're terrible. But she's not wrong, Chen. The failure rate for startups is what, 90%? It's a young man's game, honestly. Much more sensible to work in established industries. Emma watched color rise in Daniel's neck. Her father, oblivious as always to undercurrents, was chuckling along. Now, let's not be too harsh. Everyone has setbacks in business. What matters is resilience. Isn't that right, Mr. Chen? Absolutely, Mr. Whitmore, Daniel said, and something in his tone made Emma's stomach drop. There was too much calm there, too much control. In fact, I've found that my biggest failures taught me my most valuable lessons, especially lessons about loyalty, trust, and recognizing who your real allies are. His eyes flickered to Emma for just a second, and she felt like she'd been struck. How philosophical, Victoria said. But really, what qualifies Horizon Capital to be involved with a company like Whitmore Industries? I mean, no offense, but you seem rather... She gestured vaguely at his suit, his appearance. Modest for someone representing a serious investment firm? Victoria? Emma heard herself say, her voice sharper than intended. Three faces turned to her in surprise. She rarely spoke at these dinners. That's incredibly rude. I'm just asking questions, Victoria said, her eyes narrowing. Unless there's a reason you're so defensive about Mr. Chen? Do you two know each other? The silence that followed felt like falling. Emma could feel Marcus studying her, her father's confusion, Victoria's suspicion, and Daniel. Daniel was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. We've never met, Daniel said smoothly, saving her, though I appreciate Ms. Whitmore's sense of propriety. To answer your question, Victoria, may I call you Victoria? Horizon Capital's qualifications are quite solid. We've made several strategic acquisitions in the past 2 years. We specialize in companies that are undervalued or facing temporary challenges. Temporary challenges, Richard Whitmore repeated, his jovial expression faltering slightly. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Whitmore Industries is perfectly sound. Daniel pulled his briefcase onto his lap, and Emma felt her heart stop. She knew. Somehow she knew what was coming before he even opened it. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel said, his voice gentle now, almost kind. I think we should speak privately after dinner. There are some documents I need to share with you regarding Horizon Capital and its relationship to Whitmore Industries. What documents? Marcus interjected, his territorial instincts activated. If there's business to discuss about Whitmore Industries, as Emma's partner, I have a right to be involved. Actually, Daniel said, pulling out a folder, I don't think you do. The next 5 minutes unfolded like a car crash in slow motion. Daniel laid out papers on the dining table, right there between the roasted duck and the heirloom tomato salad. Emma watched her father's face transform from confusion to shock to something approaching horror as Daniel explained with devastating precision that Horizon Capital Ventures was a subsidiary of a larger holding company called Phoenix Enterprises. And Phoenix Enterprises, through a series of shell corporations and strategic investments, had acquired the controlling shares of Whitmore Industries 6 months ago when Richard Whitmore had been desperate for an influx of cash to cover his mounting debts. You're telling me, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, that I've been reporting to you for 6 months? Not exactly, Daniel replied. You've been reporting to Phoenix Enterprises. I'm simply the founder and CEO of Phoenix Enterprises. I haven't interfered with operations because Whitmore Industries is actually a solid company with good fundamentals. Your management hasn't been the problem, Mr. Whitmore. Your personal investments and your tendency to borrow from company funds to maintain your lifestyle, those have been the problems. Victoria's face had gone pale. This is absurd. Daddy, tell him this is absurd. Call our lawyers. Your lawyers are aware, Daniel said calmly. They've been aware from the beginning. This was all legally executed. I have documentation of every transfer, every purchase, every transaction. Emma couldn't breathe. She was watching Daniel dismantle her father's empire with the same methodical precision he'd once used to code software. But there was something else in his expression now, something she'd never seen before. Vindication, justice, revenge. But why? Her father asked, and for the first time in Emma's life, she saw him look old, vulnerable. Why the secrecy? Why the games? If you own the company, why sit here and let my daughters mock you? Daniel's eyes moved to Victoria, then to Marcus, then finally landed on Emma. When he spoke, his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Because I wanted to see who you all really were. I wanted to understand the family that Emma chose over me 3 years ago. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. What the hell is he talking about, Emma? But Emma couldn't speak. She was trapped in Daniel's gaze, in the weight of choices she'd made, in the realization that the man she'd abandoned because he'd lost everything had not only rebuilt, but had become more powerful than any of them. 3 years ago, Daniel continued, his voice steady, but Emma could hear the undercurrent of pain. I had a company called TechFlow Solutions. We developed software that would revolutionize supply chain management. We had angel investors, we had momentum, and I had someone I thought I was building a future with. Oh, God, Victoria breathed, recognition dawning on her face. You're that Daniel, the broke startup guy Emma was slumming with. Victoria, shut up, Emma said desperately. You shut up, Victoria shot back. Is this why he's here? Is this some pathetic revenge plot because you dumped him? Daniel's laugh was bitter. Revenge? No, Victoria. Business. You see, after Emma left, after my investors pulled out, I learned something interesting. One of those investors was Whitmore Holdings, your father's investment arm, though he used a proxy to hide his involvement. And I learned that the reason my investors pulled out wasn't because of market conditions or product viability. It was because someone had spread rumors about my company, about falsified data, about my integrity as a founder. The room went completely silent. Those rumors, Daniel continued, came from someone who had intimate knowledge of my company, someone who had access to our conversations, our plans, our investor materials, someone who wanted to make sure I failed spectacularly. Emma felt her blood turn to ice as Daniel's eyes moved to Victoria. It took me a year to trace it all back, Daniel said, a year of digging through shell corporations and proxy communications. But I found the evidence. Victoria, you wanted to ensure your sister came back to the fold. You saw me as a threat to the Whitmore legacy, to Emma's place in your world. So you destroyed my company. You used information Emma had innocently shared with you to sabotage every investor relationship I'd built. That's insane, Victoria said, but her voice wavered. Daddy, he's clearly delusional. Why would I even care about Emma's boyfriend? Because I was never just Emma's boyfriend, Daniel said quietly. I'd proposed to her. We were engaged. She was going to leave this world behind, and you couldn't allow that. The Whitmore daughters don't marry down. They don't leave the empire. So you made sure I had nothing left to offer her. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. She'd never told Daniel about Victoria's late-night calls 3 years ago, the subtle comments about his company, the concerns Victoria had shared about his stability, his prospects, his background. At the time, Emma had thought Victoria was being protective. Now every conversation replayed in her mind with horrifying clarity. Victoria, Richard said slowly, is this true? Of course it's not true, Victoria snapped. He's making things up to justify this hostile takeover or whatever this is. You can't actually believe— I have emails, Daniel interrupted, pulling out another folder. Communications between you and Preston Walsh of Walsh Capital Partners. Conversations where you provided confidential information about TechFlow's finances, falsified reports of product failures, even manufactured a fake sexual harassment complaint from a former employee who, it turns out, was paid by an account traced back to you. The enormity of it crashed over Emma like a wave. Her sister hadn't just interfered. She'd orchestrated total destruction. And Emma, heartbroken and terrified of poverty, had walked away without ever questioning why everything had fallen apart so suddenly. Marcus, who'd been silent, suddenly laughed. This is the most entertaining dinner I've had in months. So let me get this straight. You destroyed your sister's engagement, this guy lost everything, Emma crawled back home, and now he's somehow rich enough to own your father's company? How's that even possible? Daniel's smile was dangerous. After TechFlow collapsed, I had nothing to lose. I took the core technology I'd developed, technology I'd been too naive to patent properly, and I rebuilt from scratch. I worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and developed a supply chain software that actually worked. Within 18 months, I sold it to a Fortune 500 company for $60 million. I used that money to start Phoenix Enterprises. I've spent the last year and a half quietly acquiring struggling companies, rehabilitating them, and building an empire specifically designed to intersect with everything the Whitmores care about. He stood, gathering his papers with calm precision. As majority shareholder of Whitmore Industries, I'll be calling an emergency board meeting next week. Mr. Whitmore, you'll retain your position as CEO, but you'll report directly to me. Your salary will be adjusted to reflect industry standards rather than the inflated compensation you've been paying yourself. The company jet will be sold. The excessive expense accounts will be eliminated. Whitmore Industries will become profitable again, but not to fund your lifestyle. You can't do this, Richard said. but there was no force behind it. I can and I am, Daniel replied. It's all legal. Your lawyers will confirm it. Victoria stood up, her face flushed with rage and champagne. This is what you are. This is exactly what you are. Petty, vindictive, small. You think destroying our family makes you better than us? You're just proving that Emma was right to leave you. You're trash dressed up in a business plan. Victoria, Emma said, finding her voice finally. Stop. Just stop. Why? Victoria wheeled on her. Are you actually defending him? After everything you said about him 3 years ago? How pathetic he was. How you'd made a mistake slumming outside our world. Emma felt the words like physical blows. She'd said those things to Victoria in the aftermath, trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice, trying to bury the guilt and heartbreak under anger. I was wrong, Emma whispered. What? Victoria's eyes blazed. I was wrong, Emma said louder, standing up. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced herself to meet Daniel's eyes. I was wrong about everything. I was cruel and cowardly, and I abandoned you when you needed me most. I let my fear and my family's expectations turn me into someone I hate. Emma, sit down, Marcus commanded, grabbing her arm. She yanked away from him. Don't touch me. We're done, Marcus. We've been done for months. I've just been too weak to admit it. You're hysterical, Marcus said dismissively. This is clearly emotional. Why don't we discuss this privately? I saw the text from your secretary, Emma said flatly. I've known about the affair since July. I didn't say anything because I didn't care. That's how dead our relationship is. Marcus's face went red, but before he could respond, Daniel spoke. I didn't come here for an apology, Emma, he said, and his voice was tired now. I came here because Whitmore Industries is a good company that was being bled dry by greed and excess. I came here because I'm good at fixing broken things. And yes, maybe part of me wanted you all to see that the man you destroyed didn't stay destroyed. But this isn't about revenge. This is about justice in business. Daniel, Emma started, but he held up a hand. You made your choice 3 years ago. You chose comfort over love, security over risk. I don't blame you for that anymore. People are allowed to prioritize their own survival. But that choice had consequences for both of us. I became harder, more focused, less trusting. And you, he looked at her, really looked at her, and Emma saw pity in his eyes. You became a ghost. I can see it in you. You're miserable. Tears were streaming down Emma's face now, and she didn't bother to hide them. I know. Richard Whitmore, who'd been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly spoke. What do you want from us, Mr. Chen? Clearly you have leverage. What's your endgame? Daniel packed his briefcase carefully before responding. I want Whitmore Industries to survive and thrive. I want its employees to keep their jobs. I want honest leadership. As for your family, he looked at each of them in turn. Victoria, I'd recommend you focus on your own marriage. I have it on good authority that your husband is considering divorce. Something about discovering you forged his signature on several investment documents. Victoria's face went white. Mr. Whitmore, I'd recommend you speak to a financial advisor about personal bankruptcy. Your gambling debts are substantial, and they're not going away. Richard's hand started shaking. Marcus, I'd recommend you update your resume. Your firm is about to lose its largest client, and I've heard whispers about an SEC investigation into your trading practices. Marcus looked like he might be sick. And, Emma, Daniel said softly, I'd recommend you figure out who you actually are, not who your family wants you to be, not who you think you should be, who you are. He walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Victoria, I wanted you to know that I found the employee you paid to file that fake harassment complaint. She felt terrible about it. She had student loans and you offered her $50,000. She's agreed to provide testimony and documentation of your involvement. I haven't decided yet whether to press charges or make it public. I'll let you wonder about that for a while. After he left, the dining room erupted into chaos. Victoria and Marcus started fighting. Richard was making frantic phone calls to his lawyers, and Emma just stood there, frozen in the wreckage of her family's illusions. She found Daniel in the circular driveway, standing by a Tesla Model S that definitely hadn't been there 3 years ago. Daniel, she called out, her voice breaking. Please wait. He turned, and in the moonlight, she could see the exhaustion in his face. What do you want, Emma? I want to understand. Why did you really come tonight? Why put yourself through all of this? He was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I came because I needed to see you. I needed to see if there was any part of the person I love still in there. If you were happy with the choice you made. And, she whispered, and you're not. You're trapped in a golden cage, just like I suspected. But here's the thing, Emma. I can't save you from that. I tried to save you 3 years ago by offering you a different life, and you ran. This time, you'll have to save yourself. What if I don't know how? Then you'll learn, just like I did. He opened his car door, then paused. For what it's worth, I did love you. Past tense. I loved who I thought you were, or who you were trying to become. But people are who they choose to be when things get hard. You chose safety. I don't hate you for it anymore, but I can't forget it either. If I could go back, you can't, he said simply. None of us can. We can only go forward. He drove away, and Emma stood in the driveway until the taillights disappeared. Behind her, she could hear her family imploding. Victoria's shrill accusations, Marcus's angry denials, her father's desperate phone calls. The Whitmore empire was crumbling, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, Emma felt something other than numbness. It hurt. God, it hurt like nothing she'd ever experienced. But pain meant she was still alive. Pain meant she could still feel. She pulled out her phone and pulled up her banking app. She had her own money, a trust fund her grandmother had left her, one her father couldn't touch. It was enough. Enough to get an apartment. Enough to figure out who Emma Whitmore was when she wasn't performing for an audience. She typed out a text to Daniel, even though she wasn't sure he'd read it. You were right about everything. Thank you for not letting me forget who I could have been. I'm going to try to become her again. Not for you, for me. She didn't wait for a response. She went back inside, packed a bag, and walked out of her father's house for what she suspected would be the last time. Behind her, the Whitmore family dinner continued its implosion. Ahead of her, the night was dark and uncertain. But Emma had learned something watching Daniel tonight. Sometimes the person who loses everything is the only one who's truly free to rebuild. Sometimes being crushed is the first step to becoming whole. 6 months later, Emma would hear through mutual acquaintances that Daniel had transformed Whitmore Industries into one of the most innovative textile companies in the region, that her father had been quietly moved into an advisory role, that Victoria was divorcing her husband amid scandal. She'd also hear that Daniel had started dating someone, a fellow entrepreneur who ran a sustainable fashion startup. It hurt, but not as much as she'd expected, because by then, Emma had her own apartment, a job at a nonprofit she actually cared about, and for the first time in her adult life, she was building something that was entirely her own. She'd stopped performing, stopped pretending, stopped choosing safety over truth. She never saw Daniel again after that night. Some stories don't get fairy tale endings where the abandoned lovers reunite. Some stories end with people learning that the worst thing you can do is abandon yourself. And sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who you've become and forcing you to decide if that's who you want to stay. The Whitmore family eventually recovered financially, though they never recovered the illusion of invulnerability. Richard retired early. Victoria moved to Europe. Marcus faced charges that were eventually settled out of court. And Emma learned to be alone without being lonely, to be vulnerable without being weak, to be enough without needing approval or luxury or the validation of a family that had never truly seen her. Years later, she'd sometimes wonder what Daniel was doing, if he ever thought about her, if he'd found happiness. But mostly, she'd be grateful. Grateful that he'd come to that dinner. Grateful that he'd been strong enough to show her the truth. Grateful that he'd crushed the comfortable lies she'd built her life on, leaving her no choice but to rebuild from honest foundations. Because in the end, the man she'd abandoned hadn't just owned her father's company. He'd owned the truth she'd been running from, that sometimes love is the only thing worth betting everything on, and that playing it safe is the riskiest choice of all.